In the crisp morning air of the Los Angeles International Airport, the hum of travelers moving through the terminal buzzed like an unending symphony. Among them, quietly yet purposefully, strode Mariah Sinclair. She moved with a sense of poise and understated elegance. Mariah was no stranger to airports or the bustling chaos within. In fact, she often reveled in it. As a former international corporate attorney turned venture capitalist, airports were like second homes. Today, though, held a certain thrill. She was boarding a flight for an impromptu meeting with her partners in Chicago to discuss a potential expansion for Celestial Airlines, the very airline she'd invested in heavily not long ago. Celestial Airlines had become a passion project, a fledgling airline that promoted itself as a beacon of inclusivity and top-tier customer service. To Mariah, the idea was revolutionary in an industry that often overlooked minority travelers or provided them with, at best, mediocre experiences. From a business perspective, the numbers added up. But more than that, it was a chance to be part of a movement to change the culture of aviation, a chance she had seized eagerly. Mariah moved through the terminal to Gate B13, where the flight to Chicago was in the final stages of boarding. Her mind was focused on the upcoming discussions, and she wore an easy smile despite the early hour. A quick glance at her phone confirmed her upgrade had gone through. She'd be flying first class, a treat for herself as she knew how packed her schedule was about to become. Approaching the gate, she noticed a slight commotion. A petite, blonde flight attendant in a celestial uniform stood beside the jet bridge entrance, her face showing signs of frustration as she interacted with an older couple and their small child. Mariah couldn't hear their conversation over the murmuring of the crowd, but she could tell the flight attendant's pleasant facade was beginning to crack. It struck her as odd, given that this was supposed to be Celestial Airlines, the very model of modern, welcoming air travel. After the family moved through, Mariah stepped up to the gate agent. "Mariah Sinclair, first class," she said, handing over her boarding pass with a polite nod. The gate agent, a young man with a welcoming demeanor, checked her pass with a smile and said, "Thank you, Miss Sinclair. Enjoy your flight." Mariah moved past him toward the entrance to the jet bridge, where the blonde flight attendant, Claire, as her name tag read, stood stationed. Claire looked Mariah over briefly, her eyes settling on her dark skin and natural curls. Her lips pursed as she seemed to make a quick assessment, her eyes lingering in a way that made Mariah instantly feel like she'd been catalogued and dismissed. "Good morning," Mariah said, maintaining her polite tone as she moved to step through. Claire blocked her way, adjusting her stance slightly. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to wait. First-class passengers are boarding." Mariah's brow furrowed. "Yes, I'm aware," she replied, holding up her boarding pass that clearly displayed her seat assignment in first class. Claire's eyes flashed with a forced smile, the type one might give to a customer who seemed lost or confused. "Ma'am, I understand, but first class is currently boarding. This lane is only for first class, so you'll need to wait until we call for main cabin passengers." The implication stung, even as Mariah tried to remain calm. "I am in first class, and my boarding pass shows that," Mariah said, now with a controlled edge in her voice. Claire exhaled softly, her expression faltering before snapping back to that mask of strained politeness. She glanced at the boarding pass and gave a slight frown, barely concealing her disbelief. "Look, I know it's early, and sometimes there's confusion," Claire said, lowering her voice as though speaking to someone incapable of basic comprehension. "But this is a first-class section, and we have a dress code for our premium cabin." Mariah felt a rush of irritation now. "Excuse me?" Claire pressed her lips together, clearly annoyed. "We have a dress code. I understand you may have gotten an upgrade, but—" The gate agent from earlier, who had been observing the exchange, interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "Claire, Ms. Sinclair is indeed a first-class passenger. I checked her boarding pass myself." Claire's expression shifted briefly to one of embarrassment, but she quickly regained composure, her gaze icy as she stepped aside with a quick, "Apologies for the confusion, Miss Sinclair." Mariah walked past her without another word, her back straight and head held high, though she felt a tight knot forming in her chest. This was supposed to be her airline, or at least a part of her investment. She had backed Celestial Airlines with the idea of fostering a better experience for everyone. Yet here she was, facing the very kind of dismissive prejudice she had hoped to eliminate. When she entered the aircraft, she found her seat and placed her carry-on in the overhead bin. Settling into her seat, she took a moment to collect herself. Normally, she'd brush off these encounters, Years in corporate law had trained her to let slights and subtle jabs roll off her back. But this felt different, too close to home, especially since she knew she was going to be in a boardroom within hours, talking about this very company's commitment to customer service. The cabin filled slowly, and Mariah tried to put the incident behind her, mentally preparing for the discussions ahead. But as she sat there, she noticed Claire moving through the aisle, tending to other first-class passengers with a more genuine smile and eagerness than she had shown at the gate. It was subtle, but each gesture reinforced the feeling that Mariah was, in some way, unwelcome. When Claire eventually approached her row, she barely made eye contact. "Can I get you something to drink?" she asked, her tone now devoid of any warmth. "Sparkling water would be fine," Mariah replied evenly. Without a word, Claire nodded and moved on. Mariah watched as she lingered with other passengers, engaging in polite small talk, laughing at their jokes. It was evident that Claire had no idea who Mariah was, no idea that Mariah was not just a passenger, but one of the major investors in the very airline she worked for. The thought simmered, and Mariah's resolve strengthened. There would be a reckoning for this. When the plane landed in Chicago, Mariah waited patiently as other passengers disembarked. Claire barely glanced at her as she filed out, her expression neutral as she offered a half-hearted, "Thank you for flying with us." Mariah didn't respond, but she noted Claire's face one last time, committing her features to memory. Upon arriving at Celestial Airlines headquarters, Mariah was greeted by her partners, a small but driven group of individuals who shared her vision. They welcomed her warmly, their voices filled with excitement about the future of the airline. They all settled into the glass-walled conference room overlooking the Chicago skyline, the usual energy of collaboration buzzing through the air. However, Mariah felt a sense of gravity that contrasted sharply with her colleagues' upbeat demeanor. "We're here to discuss the recent push to solidify Celestial's brand," her partner and co-founder, David, began. "Mariah, I know you're particularly invested in our commitment to customer experience. I'd love for you to share your thoughts." Mariah leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. "I am," she began, her voice steady. "And in light of that commitment, I need to bring something to everyone's attention." The room quieted, all eyes on her. "I flew in on a Celestial flight this morning," she continued, "and unfortunately, I had an experience that highlighted a problem I believe needs immediate attention." David's expression shifted, and the others exchanged glances. "What happened?" he asked, his tone serious. Mariah recounted the encounter with Claire, her voice never wavering as she described each detail. The dismissive look, the patronizing tone, the subtle but undeniable disdain. She noticed the tightening jaws, the exchanged glances of her colleagues as she spoke. David looked especially troubled. "I invested in Celestial Airlines," Mariah said, her voice rising slightly, "because I believe in the potential to change the industry standard. And yet, today, I was treated as though I didn't belong in my own seat, on my own airline." There was a heavy silence when she finished, the weight of her words settling over the room like a fog. David nodded slowly, his eyes meeting hers with understanding. "Mariah, I'm incredibly sorry for what you went through," he said. "We designed Celestial to be different. If we're slipping already, we have a lot to examine." "Thank you, David," Mariah said, softening her tone. "I'm not bringing this up for an apology. I'm bringing it up because this incident is likely a symptom of a larger issue. If I, as a Black woman and investor in this company, can experience such disrespect, then what about our other passengers who don't have a platform to speak up?" The heads around the table nodded in silent agreement, the resolve of each person deepening. Mariah continued, "I want to make it clear that this isn't about punishing individuals, but it is about making sure that Celestial reflects the values we claim to uphold. I'd like to propose that we start by re-evaluating our onboarding training, particularly around implicit biases and customer interaction." "Agreed," David said firmly. "We'll review everything, starting today." Within the week, Claire received an invitation to attend an urgent meeting at Celestial's headquarters. The email was curt, instructing her to meet with the head of human resources. As she made her way to the office, she wondered what could have prompted the unusual summon. When she arrived, Claire was led to a conference room where David, the head of the airline, and Mariah Sinclair, the woman she remembered only vaguely from that flight, sat waiting. The atmosphere was tense, and Claire felt a prickling sense of foreboding. David leaned forward, his gaze stern. "Claire, thank you for coming. We wanted to discuss an incident that took place last week on Flight 308 to Chicago. Do you remember a passenger in first class, Ms. Mariah Sinclair?" Claire's face paled slightly as she processed the situation, her eyes darting to Mariah, who regarded her with a steady, unreadable expression. "Yes, I remember her," Claire replied, her voice barely a whisper. David's tone was unyielding as he spoke. "Miss Sinclair is not only a passenger. She's one of the main investors in Celestial Airlines. The very foundation of this company was built on her vision and support." Claire's face went through a series of emotions: shock, realization, and finally shame. She looked at Mariah, her mouth opening and closing, words of apology struggling to find voice. But Mariah remained impassive, her gaze cool and detached. "Claire, we value our team, and we believe in growth and learning," David continued, his voice taking on a finality that sent a chill down her spine. "But as a company, we cannot allow behavior that undermines our mission. Your actions weren't just disrespectful to Ms. Sinclair. They were antithetical to everything we stand for." Claire swallowed, nodding. "I understand," she whispered, eyes cast downward. After a moment, Mariah finally spoke, her voice calm but unyielding. "People make mistakes. But respect isn't negotiable, Claire. Remember that in your future endeavors." As Claire left the room, Mariah felt a sense of calm, the weight of her encounter lifting as she watched Claire's figure disappear down the hallway. She was left with the resolve that her airline would indeed be different, a place where respect was woven into the fabric of the journey.